probably continue in the meantime.
Yeah, let's get started. 5 minutes over. That's over. Go. Yeah.
Yeah, take it away, Evan. Thanks for joining again. I kind of forget where we left off, to be honest. So
yeah,
I don't know that we made much progress.
yeah. So maybe let's restart.
Then I'll just rewind, right? So my name's Evan Gilman. I'm a maintainer on the Spiffy Inspire projects. We've got users coming to us asking about ambient mode. They're using sidecar mode today. They're looking at adopting ambient mode, but there's no upstream support for a Spiffy or Spire integration for external issuer ambient mode, at least as far as I can tell. There's issues and history of conversations here and there. It doesn't seem that there's any real consensus in the project as to whether there's even appetite for supporting such an integration. In which case, you know, nothing I can do but send my users to you all. So I'm here to try and figure out, hey, what is, if we can like get some alignment on this call, it would be really helpful. I feel pretty confident that I can drum up resources to make the contributions, things along those lines. So I don't, you know, those things shouldn't be considered a problem. It's more of, hey, you know, is this something that the project would be open to accepting? And then if so, just point me in the right direction to get something rolling. You know? So I'll stop there.
From my perspective, one thing that I do, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was going in the queue after you. So
okay, from my perspective, like the one thing that I think makes it a little bit difficult to do this in open source Istio right now is that, as you know, the Spiffy spec doesn't really have a delegate mechanism, right? Spire as an implementation does, but like that's like a very implementation specific thing. I think there's a way to solve that problem, and you know, if there's like, because then at that point we're not integrating so much with a specific implementation Spiffy with a delegate, with some sort of delegate mechanism. There's like a, you know, the Spire or the Spiffy spec itself has a way to do this so that we're not tying Istio to just the Spire implementation of it, right? If there's like a generic mechanism for delegating that any implementer of the Spire spec must follow to be, or the Spiffy spec must follow and implement it, then it makes a lot more sense, I think, to hitch ourselves to that wagon, right? So I think, like, from my perspective, the biggest obstacle is not like the only API to do this is the Spire implementation of the Spiffy standard. The Spiffy standard has no way to do this. So fixing that, I think, would make this a little easier from my perspective.
So Ben, in other words, just making sure we're hearing your concern correctly. So if we end up implement this and not taking it to the Spiffy level, the only implementer who can benefit is Spire, right?
Right. Yeah, and like I think this is something the Spiffy Spire folks themselves have talked about wanting to fix. So I don't think it's particularly. I don't think it's a bad thing to say that, because like I think that would be mutually beneficial to get that to that spot. But yeah.
They're saying that Istio D is not implementing the Spiffy specification anymore because it's doing delegation, because obviously we are doing it.
I would rather, we are doing it, but there is no way to do it in Spiffy. Spiffy has no way to do delegation right now, right? So I don't want to, the only way to do this in ambient right now would be to adopt a Spire API, which is not part of the Spiffy standard. And so that, I'd rather not do that, is what I'm saying. If it would be nice to have like an actual standard API that is not just dedicated to one implementation that we could integrate with if we were to do such a thing.
Spiffy is not a specification for policies on how to get certificates. It's just a policy for how the certificate looks like. You can get it just like we do it. Yeah.
There's multiple parts though, Costin, right? There's the APIs, like the workload API, gRPC service specification. I think that's part of Spiffy, right? We don't use that in Istio. We just use the certificate. I'm probably being slightly imprecise on what the specification was called, but like the certificate specification with, you know, using your URI with this format, but not the full thing. But I think that's the gap. They're saying that the changes to those APIs to support but we would need our in Spire only, not in Spiffy, if I understand right then.
Yeah, that's correct. I would say that I put a link to the issue. There's an active effort right now to standardize that interface in Spiffy. We see that also as something that needs to be done. It will be done. And I would look towards, like, if we're undertaking contribution of this feature upstream, it would absolutely be aligned with the standardized interface, and we'd be looking to folks in your community to help steer the shape of that too.
So Ben, if this API as it exists in Spire today were just copied and pasted into Spiffy, I'm not suggesting we do that, but if that were to happen, would that satisfy your concerns?
Not mine. I mean, I would be very, very much against taking yet another way to get certificates. We have the SDS, which we use for some things. We have the Citadel protocols that we use for other things. We have another kind of protocol, I think, with a variation of SDS that we are using for Sidecar. We have more than enough standards to get a certificate. We don't need another one. What we need is just to implement, for any implementation like Spire, to implement our either SDS, which is ideal because it's already what sidecars are doing and probably they're already implementing it, or the Citadel proto.
Thanks, Costin. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
The difficulty with SDS is we don't really need a way to distribute certs. We need a way to let something that is external to Istio attest workloads on our behalf. We need to support CAs that can do arbitrary workload attestation, right? Otherwise, we are either going to have to say you only get the attestations that Istio supports, no matter what workload CA you use, which is not great, or we have some sort of unhappy compromise. So, like, I don't care so much about the delivery mechanism of the certs, like the API. I guess I want to be able to. Basically Istio to be able to delegate, say, I want you to attest this workload, and if your attestations, which I know nothing about, succeed, then I want to cert. And that this, as long as the channel for that is secure, I kind of don't care about the API. Going back to Mitch's question about the existing delegate API, the selector-based API that Spire had for a while, that I think Cilium uses, that one isn't acceptable to us because it basically bypasses all the Spire attestation. The delegate is responsible 100% for implementing all attestations. Spire doesn't do any checks and just says, here's your cert, go, I trust you 100%. The PID-based one is nice because that means that both sides have to, there's mutual trust, like, so that it's not just a complete offloading of, Spire does no attestation. That API is inherently flawed in that regard, and that it doesn't allow basically the external workload attester to do any attestation, which is not a great API. So that specific API is not acceptable, but it sounds like the one that would be standardized is expressly interested in solving that problem. So we probably wouldn't have an issue with that.
And also the API we currently use is solving the same problem because sidecars are using, can use a UDS socket and can do all the attestation that we need. It's not like we are insecure right now and we are giving certificates.
Right, that's sidecar. Ambient is a very different kettle of fish in that regard.
I mean, the protocol doesn't care if it's ambient or not. The protocol is basically...
The protocol doesn't, but the security model changes a lot because you have a shared node proxy that's attesting on behalf of, or has to figure out a way to attest things that it or not it, right?
Just like Istio can verify the node identity, it can verify with Kubernetes. There is no difference. I mean, the policies that Istio implements today for ambient can be implemented as well on the node level, or can be implemented with some random CA that happens to communicate with a UDS socket. There is no change in.
Agree. The downside of that, though, is that then ztunnel, it is constrained. The attestations it can support are exactly those and no more. No matter if the CA you're using supports 10 other ones, can't use them. Only what ztunnel can attest is what ztunnel supports attesting for those workload identities. And you can't use any sort of external workload CA that may, like in Spire's case, support attesting 10 other things that Istio can never know about and ztunnel doesn't have the ability to understand, right? It's constraining
Can I add something?
feature. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just hypothetically, let's say we set up ztunnel to support STS, and over it we would send a request that says, give me the cert for pod ABC. What is missing that couldn't be done on Spire? Couldn't Spire say, pod ABC, that's on this node, it has these attributes, I verified these through my Spire attestation semantics and then do whatever it wants?
Yes, it could. It doesn't have an API. Right now, the way Spire works is more generic than that, right? Because it supports many other things besides Kubernetes. So it typically wants a lower level identifier than the pod ID so that it can then, check Kubernetes attestations, node level attestations, maybe cloud provider attestations, a whole suite of whatever it's got, right? So
right, but what I mean is, if we give it something that can identify a pod, I wouldn't say IP probably. I'd say UID.
Yes, if we can give it some unambiguous identifier that it can attest out of band as well, and that we aren't likely to get mix-ups over or whatever, then yeah, or have confused deputy issues around as much. Yeah, that would work just fine. It needs to be a stable identifier that is low level enough for Spire to be able to do what it does, or any other workload API, workload CA, right? I don't want to over-index on Spire, right? It's as long as it's low level enough to do that, it's fine, right? I don't really care if it's a PID or a pod ID. It's kind of the same either way from the attestation perspective.
So Ben, I'm looking through the comments on this issue on GitHub. I see in July you made some changes to the Spire API and said, once these merge, we have what we need for ambient Spire integration. Is that the API you're saying that we need that doesn't have that implicit trust or?
Yeah, that's the API that solves the problem that the existing Spire delegate API has. The Spire delegate API traditionally has taken selectors, which is basically the delegate does all attestations and says, here, trust me, this is the pod, just give me the cert, basically. And then Spire does no checks and gives it the cert. That's the current delegate API. The old delegate API was selectors. That wasn't acceptable. The changes I made added PID as an identifier, which is much nicer because then you can actually give the PID to Spire and it can perform whatever checks have been configured on the Spire end and give you the cert only if those attestations pass. So we're actually leaning on Spire to attest things as it should.
But we don't want to be dependent on Spire or we want any implementation of a per node CA provider, certificate provider that is using whatever policies they want to be able to get all the information it needs from zTunnel to verify that it's zTunnel asking for the information, just like Citadel is doing, and do whatever it wants. So we do not need to change anything in what we have today. We have the SDS protocol, which works perfectly. We tested it sidecars. It needs to be implemented differently to do different checks on the PID, just like today is doing, presumably. So zTunnel is treated specially and can get any certificate. Regular pods can still get them normally because they may have sidecars.
If we think there's a way, like SDS versus anything else, if we can do that without creating our own weird variant of SDS that's not really Envoy compliant, I don't care. That's fine. Like SDS, whatever. Well, okay. If we want to go further,
but you have to, because SDS is just saying, give me this resource, but it's up to a agreement between the client and server to decide what a resource name means, right?
Yes, but again, as long as the server, whatever it is, can identify zTunnel or the pod, it can implement whatever policy and give you whatever certificate it believes.
Oh yeah, certainly. I just mean like we'll have to say somewhere that zTunnel will send SDS requests in a format that says resource name equals the pod UID or the pod server, but whatever we decide.
Exactly.
We'll just, it's not like SDS is not a complete protocol specification. It's more like the transport protocol. But as long as we can define those, in some sense, we're making our own standard on top of the existing standards, but there is not an existing one. So we don't have a choice.
John, hopefully we'll use exactly what we sent to Citadel because we don't need to invent slightly different standard for this case. Whatever we send to Citadel as identity, we ask on the other side.
Yeah, maybe I can bring up my point, which vaguely touches on that. And it's not really a point, it's more of a checking my understanding, which maybe is helpful for others. And specifically, I'd love if Evan could call me out if I have made any bad assumptions. The way I've been looking at things is that, like if we look at metrics, there's like 1,000 metrics backends, and we don't really want to be in the business of having 1,000 metrics integrations, right? We want to use the smallest number of standards that we can use that then can be fanned out by integration points to all the other ones. So today we only support Prometheus, and it's kind of the universal input to all these different things. And there's a lot of different projects that take Prometheus and send them to various places, usually like OpenTelemetry. There's less of an obvious thing in the CA space. What we do have today is the Istio CSR API, which, while hyper-specialized to Istio, does have alternative implementations, namely Cert Manager. So today with Cert Manager, you can integrate with like 20, 30 providers that they have as backends to Cert Manager. So my initial thought was like, well, why do we need, all these 30 people did the integration with Cert Manager. Why can't Spire be the 31st? Why do we need a special implementation for it? And the conclusion I came up with is that there's really two different types of CA, like ways to get certificates. Kind of like how, honestly, with metrics, there's two. There was like push versus pull, but pull can be kind of translated to push. But for certificates, like we're sending a certificate signing request, whereas there's still a gap for CAs that don't want to sign certificate signing requests. They want to actually just give you the full certificate and private key directly. So to me, that kind of warrants, aside from like all the nitty-gritty details about like protocols and things like that, actually having two distinct integration points for CAs to meet those two different use cases. Is that a reasonable way to look at things, or?
I would say those are the two modalities, yes. And we typically see like the CSR flow in places where you're doing web PKI and web PKI auth. And then we see the, no, these are your creds, and kind of like the internal workload identity cases. CSR, you usually need to know in advance what the identity is, right? There's a whole bunch of different semantics there.
Yeah.
In Istio, we ignore the identity provided in CSR. We just override it with whatever Citadel wants. So it's not really critical. And again, it's not really a big difference. The CA can decide, hey, you send me a CSR, I'm going to ignore it. Here is a new private case that you should use. Goodbye. I mean, it's not like the client has the power here. Louis, sorry.
So it seems like we're having a debate between two potential standard APIs, right? SDS and the workload attestation API. One of those APIs is going to end up hopefully in a standard, and one of those APIs is embedded inside Envoy. In the dynamics of standardization, standardizing the API on the client side or on the producer side has different effects. Evan, do you have a sense for what the other CA vendors want to do? Would they prefer to be an SDS provider, or would they prefer to be a SPIFFE implementer? Because in the long run, that's really going to dictate, right, the utility of the integration and API standardization. So, obviously you're a vendor here, so inherent bias, but you do talk to a lot of these people. Do you have a sense for what the other CAs want to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think
they want to standardize on.
I think it's important to highlight here that, SPIFFE is a pretty different beast from a traditional CA PKI stuff, right? And, I'll point to the JOT support. It's the very first wrinkle in that. And what I've seen is, legacy, I call legacy PKI vendors. We're talking about like CyberArk, Vault, these kinds of folks, right? Small step. They're not changing the way that they think about old school PKI, Acme, and web PKI controls and all this kind of stuff. But they are implementing SPIFFE standards, as evidenced by identified press releases and other things like this. Because it's a different shape problem and a different need. It doesn't necessarily like say, hey, we're going to start building our PKI in the direction of SPIFFE. It's a neighboring problem space. I hope that makes sense.
I mean, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, there are plenty of identity providers that sign certificates, sign JOTs, sign whatever they want, SSH certificates and other things. It's not, I mean, that's a policy that provider has what they sign and how. Protocol-wise, I think we have to hopefully agrees that ACME is pretty much the de facto standard that almost everyone is using in the CA world. It's not that, I mean, it's a dominant standard if you want. And it could be used.
For public
Not
identities.
for private, not true. The STEP CA and others are supporting private CAs as well and can be used for everything. It's a standard. It doesn't say anything that you need to use.
But I wouldn't say it's anywhere close to dominant, right? For internal identity, like role account identity provisioning, it is nowhere near the dominant use case.
It is not commonly used for that, but it works perfectly fine for this use case.
I'm sure it can work. But that, like, lots of things can work. That's not really useful, right? Like, what are the dominant providers of workload identity today outside of the CSPs, right? Where they do it themselves, right? It's built in.
By dominant, I mean it has tons of implementation. Any language has a bunch of at least 3 implementation of ACME standard, and it can be used if someone implements the ACME standard. It can integrate with pretty much everyone. And there is no product that I know or language that doesn't have an ACME library. That's what I mean by dominant.
But that's also irrelevant. Custom, that's also irrelevant here. Like, we don't care about that. We care about our ability to get identities from the providers. We only have to implement in one language.
True,
like the dominant provider of workload identity today is Kerberos with Active Directory by a country mile.
Perhaps true for workload identity, but I don't know. My point is, the more implementation of ACME exists, the more use cases will be supported. You can get domains, you can get all kind of things. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to argue.
Yeah, and when it becomes dominant workload identity provided in enterprise, we'll integrate with it. Until that point, why?
Because it's a better standard. It's supported in a lot of places. It's tested. It's not like Envoy only, and you know, all other waypoints and implementation will probably support ACME no matter what, because they need to get.
Why hasn't it supplanted Kerberos?
That I don't know. I haven't seen Kerberos using quite a while, so I don't know why. I'm sure that enterprises, Microsoft. Oh, Kit has it stand up, so we can speak about it.
There are thousands and thousands of enterprises you're using Kerberos and Active Directory. Evan, am I completely off base on that one, or is that no?
No, these are 2 very different things. You know, see, I don't think we should conflate the 2. Remote CSR fulfillment is totally one different thing about DNS identifiers and other shit like this, and it's a totally different thing from workload identity. You don't even get a look at that process, at that workload. You don't get to measure it. You don't anything, right? And so it's a very different concept. When it comes down to like, oh, is it going to be the spiffy, delegated thing, or is it going to be SDS? Whatever, right? What I want to see is my software projects work with your software project. Of course, I would prefer that, the spiffy standardized interface be adopted, but I also understand if that's a burden on, maintenance burden or other things like this. And so at the end of the day, like for me, sure, I have a preference on those 2 things, but those 2 things is one. And this whole PKI, ACME, CSR related stuff is in my mind, a very different beast.
Okay. So, I mean, do you see an issue with Spire implementing SDS support?
Spire already speaks SDS today, and that's how we do the sidecar support. I think.
Right, but adding the support to do the other bit.
Yeah. So, what this delegated identity API is really all about under the covers is, hey, I need a way to reference a collocated workload such that the spiffy implementation can go and do its measurements and attestations and whatnot. Whether you do that reference over a spiffy delegated identity API or SDS API, we can implement support for this thing. I mean, I think it's messier on the SDS path, but like, if that's what we end up, that's what we end up. I do think that John's point earlier is kind of, well, now we're talking about like a new standard. And so, I'll leave it up to you guys on like, hey, which is the shape of these things should take. But I certainly don't think that like a CSR style flow is going to come anywhere close to solving the problem.
One question I have, so there's like the protocol shape, which is important, but not that important ultimately. You could potentially translate between the shapes, but then there's actual data we put on that protocol, right? My understanding, and this might be wrong, on the delegated workload API is that like we have to pass the PID file descriptor, which seems very
Well,
implementation specific and wonky.
right now it's not the PID file descriptor. It is just the PID. It could be
Okay.
the PID FD, which is a
Don't really care like
fair enough. It's
what exactly it is, but
wonky.
like passing the process ID is a very odd. Like I get why it was done. Like I've read the design and stuff. It's just a very odd standardized way to represent a workload, right? If it seems, and maybe there's reasons why this isn't a good idea, but it seems like a more standard way would be to say, I need the identity for this service account or this pod by name or UID or whatever, like something that's more fixed to higher level things that people are commonly referring to, rather than this PID.
Yeah.
What about non-Kubernetes, Keith? It's a good question, but I don't know that we need delegation on non-Kubernetes. In that
Istio
case,
doesn't care. Yeah.
at least today, that's like the dedicated mode where it's one-to-one. Like
Yeah,
sidecars.
that's fair. That's totally fair. But I understand why Spiffy would want to solve for non-Kubernetes though. Or let me ask that to Evan though. Is there a use case you see for Spiffy to solve delegation outside of the Kubernetes use case?
That is a good question. Kubernetes use case is certainly the one that I've come across most frequently. I can hand wave it like, oh, there's folks with like internal compute platforms and other things like this. They might have different concepts than Kubernetes has. Certainly, Twitter is probably still running Mesa somewhere. But I do think that it's fair to say, hey, the 95+% cases are Kubernetes centric. Because if you're doing this API, there's some notion of multi-tenancy in terms of like execution, right?
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't rule out other VM scheduling systems, right? Nomad.
Nomad. I was going to say Nomad with Istio. Is that the idea, Louis?
I have talked to some people who use it about it, and they are at some point likely to use it. They're probably going to migrate to Kubernetes before they do that, but VMs will probably stay around for a while. And people do have their, especially with VMware doing what it's doing in the market, I think we're seeing a growth spurt of alternate VM schedulers right now.
But just because we may want to support things other than Kubernetes doesn't necessarily mean we need to generate for the lowest common denominator of process ID, right? I hope.
Right, agreed still. I agree with that.
They're in Kubernetes. I mean, the VMs and WASM in their Kubernetes pods, they just don't use containers, but use WASM or VMs.
Yeah, they all have some form of ID in their runtime environment, and Spire would need to know about the runtime environment to perform the attestation. That's the level of coupling.
I'll just add, as I'm thinking more about at least, the implementations I'm aware of, my commercial implementation, the open source implementations of Spiffy are PID centric. Number one, because obviously we support more than just Kubernetes. Number two, because that is the way that we measure, right? Like we give capabilities like, hey, we can tell you exactly which binary is calling us and the SHA of that thing, where it loaded from. The level of granularity on the attestation system is like process level, POSIX process level. So if we go up, you're gonna lose some of that. And just thinking about how it would be implemented in EG Spire, where all the attestation plugin systems are all PID centric, right? Because they're trying to latch onto a process and measure it. I think there will be implementation challenge there. Which PID do we pass?
So for PID centric, do you actually attest to every single PID the container or the pod runs?
We attest the PID which calls the API.
Whatever is given is what is attested. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you gave them all the PIDs in the pod, then they would attest all. If you gave them just one, they would attest just one.
Got it. So Evan, I have a question for this 313 you point out. I guess you probably don't have an estimation because maybe you don't have a sense of when the Spiffy community might endorse such an API. Because I'm trying to think, I mean, let's say if this community would endorse the API, let's give a rough estimate, let's say 6 months. And if you actually come into Istio today and implement something that supports the delegation API from Spell and only works with Spell, would somebody else have to rework that work? When Spiffy also supports delegation API and also the Spiffy delegation API, there could be an iteration which may not be exactly the same as the Spell delegation API, I'd assume, because it's when it goes to upstream, sometimes there's more iteration on the API. There's, driving consensus takes time. Would somebody have to redo the work too?
Remember, I'm suggesting that I'll figure out how to get the contributions out. So I'm not trying to throw this work onto anyone. It is absolutely a concern that people are latching onto this Spire specific API, which is why we're having this conversation in Spiffy. It would be my intention to co-develop that with this community. And if we have the support of this community around the shape of that API and thumbs up saying, yes, we can get behind this, it would certainly go a long ways in pushing that work through Spiffy.
While the standard is getting through the years of processes and other things, would it be possible to just get SDS as it's used by sidecars? Even if it's not perfect, even if it's not, get it working so we can have some solution for people who want to have per node issuers. Using the PID, because with SDS over UDS, you get pretty much exactly the same information. Using the same thing that Citadel is using, for verify that zTunnel is the one asking. And just get it running, and the standards, whatever standards exist, will evolve in parallel. Because Kubernetes has its own standards. There are plenty of things will change in a year or 6 months or whatever. Who knows? WASM, VMs, and other things will probably be more popular. We don't know yet. So the standard may come dead on arrival anyways if we wait so long. But at least we solve the problem immediately, and we get things moving for users.
Yeah, one concern, Costin, is I think long-term, we want to end up with one additional integration point. So if we add SDS now, we can't remove it. And the other thing is, even if we add, we can't just do SDS like sidecars do, because they request a resource called default. And there's no way to know which identity we want, right? So we'll at least have to add some semantics on the resource naming.
So with Citadel, we kind of ask for default, and we can use it instead of default. The only problem is that we cannot replace default with the name of the pod, fully qualified name of the pod. I think that's and instead of, just for this reason, we wait 6 months or whatever to define a brand new standards, because we just cannot use the pod identity that we typically use with Citadel to pass it instead of default. That's kind of a very lousy reason to. And it's not a new standard. We are using it pretty much everywhere in Istio today. We are using it for sidecars.
I think I actually agree with you mostly. It just maybe not on what happens after 6 months. I think maybe the best path, unless I hear reasons against it, but I seems like using SDS, and then in 6 months maybe Spiffy comes out with an API, and worst case scenario, you can have a shim that translates from SDS to that API potentially, right? And then we only need one integration built into zTunnel, but you could still integrate with all these things. I'm not against things sitting between things, right? That's how Cert Manager works today, right? We speak our Istio API, Cert Manager supports it, Cert Manager speaks to 30 CAs. That's a perfect situation. It's exactly how metrics work with OpenTelemetry as well. Now, if Evan or others say no, that's never going to work, we can't actually even do that, that would be a very compelling reason not to go down that route.
The only thing that I see as not working is latching on to these kinds of CSR remote fulfillment flows. Whether it's SDS API, I think there's devil in the details, right? The resource naming you're talking about, those kinds of things we'll need to work through. But whether it's SDS API or the Spiffy thing or whatever, I think all of those are solutions that will get the users the functionality.
But we kind of already sort it out, because a new name instead of default is what zTunnel is using with Citadel. So we don't need to invent a brand new name. My suggestion is just to use exactly the same naming that Citadel we use Citadel between. Yeah, you got what I'm saying. One point I want to make is that if we are talking about standards, the standard that probably will be very interesting in 6 months is a standard to allow agents that actually signs, that use TPMs and virtual TPMs, which work with VMs and other things, and actually do not provide the private key to the workload, and don't take a CSR because the private key stays in protected environments, and that's the standard probably we should kind of focus, because it's a very important use case.
I mean, yes, I agree that it's an important use case, but I think that sort of makes me think that STS might not be appropriate. Just because, again, the idea of the thing that's issuing credentials, identity to via TPM, the idea of that speaking STS in some way feels not likely. So even if we can agree on a semantic for naming, so I'd be more interested in understanding more of what Evan was saying earlier about what Spire and different attestation tools are wanting to be able to provide. I have similar concerns to John, just as far as not racing to the lowest common denominator, and maybe have something that makes sense, especially because delegation is a specific use case. But if it's PID, then it's PID. It's just going to depend on the conversation there. Zooming all the way out, now I arrived a little bit later, so apologies if this was already discussed. I think what I'm hearing from folks is that this is something like from the Istio community that we're interested in having. There are lots of conversations we want to discuss, or we want to have and discuss about the exact shape of what this looks like. But I think the idea of integrating with a standard and SPIFFE sounds like there's general agreement that that's something that we're in favor of. Am I reading the room correctly there?
Kind of. Like, I'm kind of saying I want to integrate with whole-based, I don't know if there's a better term for this, CAs, of which Spire and SPIFFE may be one of them. Like, that's just a more broad statement than I want to integrate with Spire, right?
I think my statement is a bit more specific than I want to integrate with CAs, and less specific than I want to integrate with Spire, or more general than I want to integrate with Spire. I'm talking about like the SPIFFE effort, right? Specifically,
Yes.
the issue that everyone's posting.
Yeah.
It's sounding to me like there's agreement that if SPIFFE comes up with a standard that is not specific to Spire, then we as a community would be in favor of supporting that standard.
Maybe. I mean, I guess other people are agreeing with you, but in my mind, the goal is to integrate with the most number of CAs with the least number of complexity for us. So if the SPIFFE API is the way to do that, fine, but I don't care if it's a SPIFFE API or something else that achieves that goal, right?
Okay,
But
so we
SPIFFE adoption is going to make it more generally applicable than simply having it in Spire, right? It's a step towards that generality and standardization. Is that right, John?
I mean, having it in SPIFFE is better than having it in Spire, yes, but like presumably other people are going to implement this out in Spire, right? Probably some people on this call. So like, are all these options being considered viable approaches for you guys? Am I wrong that you guys are going to implement something like this? Because I really don't want to say like we're going to go implement the SPIFFE API, and then a year from now some vendor comes and says, actually, that was a bad idea. I need this XYZ functionality and I can't do it in SPIFFE, and we have this conversation again.
We
Right.
already made that mistake with the ones in Spire, so now we got to fix it in SPIFFE.
I'm pretty sure GK has, specific ways to get per node certificates and to do this. And I think that in Kubernetes upstream as well, some of the work happens in open source as well. So definitely, I don't think it's Spire based. It's based on what kubelet and whatever daemons exist. But that's pretty clear that it's happening.
So I will say on the kubelet, on the per pod certificate thing, is that might not necessarily be something that we could even use, because it's very at this point in time, it's very scoped to kubelet, and very scoped to, I believe, per pod certs versus per service account. So I would have to go back and double check the specifics there. But in my mind, the difference here is what you're saying, John, or rather, the argument I would make to you, John, is that the different kinds of flows that we're talking about way toward the beginning of the conversation. Is that there's an attestation-based flow with node agents, which is what Spire's providing, and then there's the general certificate fulfillment, the CSR fulfillment flow, which something like Kubernetes CSR or Threat Manager provides. I think those are two distinct processes, and regardless of, they require two different integration points regardless. And so I'd almost I'd apply that scoping, that framing of two different approaches to your question, except I just wouldn't group them together. So you want to integrate the best number of CAs is one goal, and I think that lends itself to the Kubernetes CSR type of certificate fulfillment, CSR fulfillment flow. Yeah. And then the other question is we want to integrate with other attestation frameworks, and that's where this fits in my mind. It's Istio Citadel provides both today, but I see them as two actual distinct value propositions.
All right, we can't spin endlessly around prospective standards. I think it's probably the best way to put it. And Evan, to be fair, right now, yours is also a prospective standard, with a potential adopter of one, hopefully more, but still hopefully. Maybe you have some commitments.
Well,
perhaps we.
Sorry, continue.
Perhaps we would just be better on settling on SDS now and saying, if Evan is successful in his endeavors and gains traction to meet what John said, which is the thing that integrates with the most CAs, then we move to it. And we're used to moving. And given that this is an unstable space, we should anticipate a move. Does that sound reasonable to everyone?
My goal for today is really just to say, like, hey, is there interest in getting an integration working? Like, it sounds like the answer is yes, right? So
yes.
From my perspective, that's great. I think we should have conversations. If it's SDS with what we want to do first, I think we should have some conversations about exactly what that looks like and make sure that it's going to work. Happy to go that route if that's what the room wants to do. We'll do a race on Spiffy. But like either way for me is fine.
Okay. Then I think.
Yeah, so Evan, maybe when you have more data and you can circle back with the community then, maybe in a couple of weeks or months, depends on your progress on the SDS path.
So what's then the advice in terms of how I should push this forward? Do I need to send a proposal somewhere on what this would look like over SDS? You know, what are the next
I think the proposal is pretty much what we discussed. I mean, the same things that Sidecar is using, because that's the protocol we have, with the only change that John suggested, which is replacing default with a different string. And I suspect the strings that we use for Citadel is a string we want to use for SDS as well for consistency. We don't need to invent a new one. So whatever zTunnel is sending through Citadel, it would send over SDS to local agent.
Well, let's review it to make sure it's not. It's
Sure.
at least sensible, right? Like, and Evan should be able to provide some feedback on it.
Yeah.
But I think, Evan, the next step is just open an issue. That's how we track this kind of stuff.
Okay, on Istio?
Yeah.
So we do have an open tracking issue that's linked at the document above, and Evan's already commented on it. Is there a reason not to just reuse that?
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can reuse it. Yeah. So maybe create a design doc, and when it's ready, you can socialize with the community again.
And Evan, I can work on getting a document created and making sure you have edit access, etc.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Okay. We have 10 minutes left. Do we have anything else to talk about?
I think that was the only agenda item.
Yeah, thank you, Evan, for being on the call twice.
Thank you all for entertaining me.
I guess the one last item to discuss, we talked about a little bit in the last meeting. We had no agenda for the last meeting, and that does seem to be a more and more common occurrence. So we discussed the possibility of moving to 1 hourly community meeting, but perhaps adding a second monthly TOC meeting. It's a net reduction in meetings by about 3 hours a month, but giving a little bit more frequent feedback from the TOC rather than reducing all or a simple reduction.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the proposal there. I wanted to get feedback in this room. I see a couple thumbs up.
That seems reasonable. I mean, we split out the ambient track from the general work track because ambient was in massive development, right? And so it needed its own dedicated forum. We're obviously, I wouldn't say putting an ambient in maintenance mode at this point, but you know, it's becoming part of the normal course of business and needing a bit less perhaps. So that actually sounds like a reasonable change to me.
Yeah. So the question now is, should we keep this meeting or an hour ago? How do you guys feel? Which time works better? I feel like maybe this meeting have more attendance. Is that true? I think Cost and Louis, you guys don't normally join the work group meeting.
That was more a function of some conflicts, and then also what I was spending most of my time on was design work for ambient, and so I was a little less involved in Psychory things. But I don't have a strong preference between 9 and 10. So
yeah, no, I have a meeting. I'm sorry, I have a meeting that I cannot change. It's kind of mandatory, and I have to go there every day.
That's
I just join in companion mode only.
That's
Okay,
at
so
9
this
a.m.
time-
Pacific.
Yes, 9 a.m. Pacific. So
Okay,
this meeting is
so
perfect for me.
let's just use this time then. So if it works better for you, I don't see other people have strong opinions. So
Okay. I
So
will try to get
starting next
that change
week,
propagated out to the calendar and the
Yeah,
Istio community
okay.
drive.
And I did let you guys know we are not going to join the meeting next week because we have an offsite. So I'll let you guys lead the meeting next time.
Enjoy.
Yeah, thanks. All right. I think we're all set on the meeting too.
All right.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Yeah,
Evan.
thanks everybody.
Thanks, Evan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.